Ancient and modern history is full of events we all know were tragic, but dig a little deeper into the complete stories and you'll find that they're even sadder than what's on the surface.
You might be forgiven for thinking that the most disturbing part of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD was the sheer suddenness of Pompeii's destruction. But while the town's destruction was unspeakably tragic, the speed at which it happened wasn't nearly the worst thing about it. Two festivals happening in the town at the same time meant the tragedy at Pompeii ended up so much worse than it should have been. According to the book Pompeii, an archaeological guide, the Pompeians were in the middle of a multi-day celebration in honor of the Emperor Augustus. Known today as the first emperor of the Roman Empire, Augustus had died 65 years earlier and had just been made a god, as well as having the month of August named after him. Pompeii's streets were filled with public celebrations, including street musicians, fortune tellers, plays, and athletic events. Many of those performers and athletes came from outside Pompeii to take part in the event, as did the visitors and tourists who came to see them. We can't know exactly how many extra people were in the town at the time of its destruction, but it is certain a lot more lives were lost than might have happened if the eruption had happened a month later. Even worse, the day before the eruption was Vulcanalia, the festival of the god Vulcan, otherwise known as the god of fire and volcanoes. It wasn't so much that the people of Pompeii didn't get a warning that Mount Vesuvius was going to erupt, because there definitely would have been smoke, small earthquakes, and loud rumblings at the very least. It was more that because of Vulcanalia, they would have interpreted these signs as good omens from the god rather than the warnings to get out of Dodge. As far as the townspeople cared, these warnings were simply signs that Vulcan was busy at his forge inside Mount Vesuvius, perfectly happy that everyone was celebrating his special day.
Pompeii! And it's Volcano Day!
It wasn't just the timing of the festivals that screwed everyone over in Pompeii, though. It was also the weather. According to Perspecta Weather, the wind in that part of Italy during August tends to blow in a southwesterly direction. If this had been the case during the eruption, the cloud of ash and deadly gas from the volcano would have blown away from Pompeii. Sure, there still would have been the whole heat and lava thing to contend with, but that wasn't what killed most people in the city. If the ash and gas had spread in the direction the wind normally blew, far more people would have likely survived. But for some reason, that day the wind was blowing to the northwest, straight towards Pompeii. Aside from dooming the town itself, this also meant that many of the townspeople couldn't escape. Pompeii sits on a bay, and some people evidently attempted to escape by ship, but our only eyewitness account of the tragedy, by Pliny the Younger, says the wind was blowing dead inshore and stopped terrified residents, including his own uncle, from leaving that way. Their most effective escape route was blocked off because of a bizarre change in the weather. In fact, the nature of the wind that day was so bizarre that it has caused some historians to think we have the date of the eruption wrong. According to the Australian National Maritime Museum, the unexpected wind pattern could mean the eruption took place in autumn, later in the year than first thought. Considering many of the people of Rome lived around 2,000 years ago, it's easy to feel a disconnect between their lives and our own. But with Pompeii, we don't just have the skeletal remains of those who died. We can actually see in great detail the fear on their faces at the moment of their deaths. The nature of the detail in these remains makes the town's destruction feel like so much more than just history. When Pompeii was being excavated in the early 1800s, the archaeologists realized that, when they found a skeleton, it was always surrounded by a void in the compacted ash. The diggers started pouring plaster of Paris into the spaces, and what emerged were essentially casts of people during the last moments of their lives. In essence, the archaeologists could see the exact positions they took as the ash rained down. There are even animal casts, including one of a dog writhing on its back, twisted as if in great pain.
We find several groups together, 3 people together, 4 people together. It seems that they may be helping each other.
But modern technology can take this information even further. Seeker reports that in 2015, many of these casts were CAT scanned. This means we now know the victims' ages, sexes, and intimate details about their health. We can even construct accurate images of their faces, such as a 4-year-old boy frozen in terror or a baby asleep on its mother's lap. Giovanni Babino, the head radiologist on the project, said, "Working with these casts was extremely moving. It felt like I was dealing with real patients." Pliny the Younger provides our only eyewitness account of what happened on that day in Pompeii, and he didn't even write about it until more than 2 decades after the event. But his account shows that witnessing the city's destruction had a profound effect on him. Pliny was 18 and living across the bay in Misenum when the eruption began. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, had also been a naval commander in the early Roman Empire and decided to sail to Pompeii to try and rescue people. Pliny and his mother were left to escape Misenum on their own. Eventually, they left their house because the strength of the earthquakes made staying inside dangerous, and they had to keep shaking off ash so they wouldn't be crushed by the weight of it. Elsewhere in the town, people began to panic, and false rumors quickly spread about Misenum being on fire. But according to Pliny, it was the noise that was the worst. He wrote, "You could hear the shrieks of women, the wailing of infants, and the shouting of men. Some were calling their parents, others their children or their wives, trying to recognize them by their voices. People bewailed their own fate or that of their relatives, and there were some who prayed for death in their terror of dying. Many besought the aid of the gods, but still more imagined there were no gods left, and that the universe was plunged into eternal darkness forevermore." Pliny the Elder died at Pompeii, having failed to save a single life. Historians still aren't exactly 100% sure how people in Pompeii actually died, but it's mostly accepted that, in general, they were smothered by ash and gas, crushed when buildings collapsed, or hit and killed by falling debris. This is why the bodies archaeologists have found show people were largely intact when they died, but this might not have been the case for victims in other cities affected by the eruptions. According to National Geographic, in the cities of Herculaneum and Oplantis, things were all the more disturbing because they were probably hit by pyroclastic surges, catastrophic mixtures of ash, lava, and noxious gases. But the deadliest characteristics of a pyroclastic flow are heat and speed. They can move at 50 miles an hour and reach temperatures of 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. That kind of all-consuming heat can effectively flash fry a person to death. It causes a person's bodily fluids to boil instantaneously, including those inside their brain, essentially causing their head to explode. Within 10 minutes, all the soft tissue on their body would vaporize, and there's strong evidence that this happened to many of the victims in Herculaneum and Oplantis. If Egypt has taught us anything, it's that people really do not give a toss about the sanctity of the dead, with tombs in that country being ransacked almost as soon as they were sealed. The same is true in Pompeii. Despite it being the final resting place for thousands of victims, all grave robbers tend to think about is how much shiny stuff is buried with them. And the residents who fled their homes in terror did make it easy for these thieves, since many of them grabbed all their valuables to bring with them. Since Pompeii wasn't really rediscovered until the 1700s, these grave robbers have remained active up to the present day. Pompeii's official website mentions archaeologists unearthing one room and finding tunnels dug in the ash and the skeletal remains of 6 individuals thrown around, damage done by humans, not a volcano. A shop was also discovered in 2016 with evidence that looters had been there first, although thankfully they managed to miss a hoard of gold coins found inside. In 2017, there was actually so much tomb raiding that, for the archaeologists, it became a race to dig out new areas before they were found by crooks. Not everyone who steals digs a tunnel, though. Some just pick stuff up when they visit as tourists. Luckily, a lot of them come to regret that decision. According to The Telegraph, in recent years, authorities have been sent 100 packages returning items pilfered as souvenirs, with many of the repentant grave robbers believing the objects had brought them bad luck. Perhaps the worst thing to happen to Pompeii since the eruption was the fact that, for a long time, it wasn't even properly taken care of. And it wasn't the archaeologists in the 1800s who screwed up, but those in charge of the site during the second half of the 20th century. In 2008, The Guardian reported that the Italian government had declared a state of emergency at Pompeii, not because the volcano was about to erupt again, but because the historic site was in such a state of disrepair. The conditions were described as squalid, with the amazing site swarmed by souvenir hawkers, fake parking attendants, and bogus tour guides. It had few signs, even fewer security guards, and only 3 bathrooms. The third of the site that was still buried was even being used as an illegal trash dump. But more dire, according to Reuters, was the decades of neglect the UNESCO World Heritage Site had suffered, with visitors expressing shock at the site's decay. Frescoes and stones that had survived almost 2,000 years were deteriorating at an alarming rate, with thousands of pieces lost every year. Restoration work that had started in 1978 was still nowhere near being completed. The culture minister at the time stated that to call the situation intolerable doesn't go far enough, and a year-long state of emergency was quickly declared. A special commissioner was thus appointed to try to save the site before human laziness and selfishness could destroy Pompeii all over again. To this day, the volcano that destroyed Pompeii is considered one of the most dangerous in the world. Mount Vesuvius made it pretty clear it wasn't messing around when it buried numerous towns and killed thousands of people back in 79 AD, but that eruption wasn't even the most destructive in terms of damage. That happened in 1631. But for some reason, the area at its base is still regarded as prime real estate. 6 million people currently live close to Vesuvius, and according to Volcano Discovery, 3 million of them are at serious risk if it ever erupts again. And the problem is that Vesuvius tends to get very angry very quickly. Unlike some volcanoes, Vesuvius doesn't let off small warning eruptions before the big one. Instead, this volcano tends to sit perfectly quietly for a long time and then suddenly let off a massive, deadly eruption. It also has a much tighter timescale for eruptions than other volcanoes, so even though it last blew in 1944, it could easily go again tomorrow. Even some supervolcanoes are considered less dangerous than Vesuvius. The Italian government has multiple plans in place should another eruption occur. At a minimum, 600,000 people would need to be evacuated from the immediate risk zone on the lower slopes of the volcano. Unfortunately, it's uncertain whether these plans would actually be effective or not, and seems almost a given that not everyone will be saved.
From faulty O-rings to deadly weather and foreboding warnings, the engineers closest to the Challenger space shuttle knew what was wrong, so why didn't NASA step in? The Challenger was destroyed due to a faulty O-ring seal in one of its booster rockets, allowing burning gas to escape. The rubber O-rings weren't supposed to be burned by the gases resulting from liftoff, but that's exactly what happened during the testing phase. Shockingly, according to the Rogers Commission report, when it was found that the O-rings could be damaged, engineers at both NASA and Morton Thiokol, the company contracted to design and build the rockets, decided that the situation was undesirable but acceptable. A test in 1977 revealed another ominous problem. The rocket ignition could cause parts of the rocket's steel casing to bend outward, reducing the pressure on the O-rings. Keep in mind, the opposite was supposed to happen, with parts bending inward and helping the O-rings to seal properly. At this point, engineers began to sound the alarm. One characterized the current design as unacceptable in October 1977, and another stated in January 1978 that redesign was necessary to, quote, prevent hot gas leaks and resulting catastrophic failure. Despite this, nothing was changed. NASA had more than theory to go on after its second shuttle mission when the Space Shuttle Columbia flew in November 1981. When they recovered and examined the shuttle's right rocket booster, one of its primary O-rings had been eroded badly. The news was ultimately met with no action. Multiple subsequent shuttle missions during the 1980s showed O-ring damage, yet still the design wasn't changed.
We learned that little things that seem harmless can become catastrophic events.
By 1985, engineers at Morton Thiokol had another concern about the O-rings. Their concern was based around how the cold weather could loosen the O-rings' elasticity. Given that NASA's bevy of planned shuttle missions included winter launches, this was a problem. As told by NASA Space Flights, one of the engineers, Bob Ebling, wrote a memo in October 1985 entitled it Help, in the hope of finally drawing attention to the issue. No help came. On January 27, 1986, NASA called Morton Thiokol and asked how they felt about a launch in 18-degree weather, because the O-ring's lower threshold of safety was 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The engineers, when hearing this, were aghast. Ebling called his team together, and they all agreed that a launch in such a temperature would be the death of the shuttle crew. In a teleconference with NASA, the engineers laid out why Challenger should not be launched the next morning and recommended that it not lift off in any temperature lower than 53 degrees Fahrenheit. As engineer Roger Beaujolais later recounted to NPR, a NASA official was appalled at the thought of waiting so long to launch. The clear, cold weather that night led to ice forming all over the launch pad, but NASA still decided to proceed. The crew were told about the ice when they were briefed on the weather that morning, but they weren't told about any concerns regarding the temperature's effects on the O-rings. To that effect, the mission was a go. As detailed by the Rogers Commission reports, Challenger's launch was scrubbed repeatedly for one reason or another. Had even one of those delays not occurred, the shuttle might have lifted off in safer temperatures. First, it was moved from January 22nd to January 23rd due to schedule ripples caused by the prior delay of another mission, SDS-61C, and then the Program Requirements Change Board moved liftoff to January 25th. After that, the after effects of SDS-61C's delay bumped Challenger again to January 26th. The evening before the new launch date, the mission was pushed off yet again due to a forecast of wind and rain, which turned out to be entirely wrong. As Gene Thomas, launch director for the Challenger mission, recalled, "We decided we would not launch on Sunday, and Sunday was a beautiful day. We missed an opportunity to launch." Challenger's crew were strapped in and ready to go on the morning of January 27th when another problem reared its head. A screw wouldn't release from the shuttle's crew hatch. A drill was brought in, but its battery was dead. According to NASA spaceflight, 9 more batteries were brought to the launch pad, and for reasons unknown, every single one went dead. Liftoff was finally pushed back one more time to January 28th.
What should have been a day heralded for education turned to tragedy in a split second.
At 11:38 a.m. on January 28th, Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center. Footage later showed that dark smoke began to jet from one of the right-side solid rocket booster's O-rings less than a second after liftoff began. The shuttle broke the sound barrier 40 seconds up, and at around 59 seconds, a plume of flame began to emit from the right-hand SRB. The crew wouldn't have known about this, as further evidenced by their yells of "woohoo" at 60 seconds, a mere quarter second before the flame began to contact the orbiter's massive external fuel tank. Per spaceflight now, even if the crew had known what was happening, there was nothing they could have done. Just before 73 seconds came the last words from Challenger spoken by Mike Smith. Uh-oh. Immediately afterward, the shuttle was torn apart as the external fuel tank erupted into a massive fireball. A few seconds later, an object was seen descending slowly by parachute. Several TV stations began to focus on footage of the object and the shock and confusion that followed. However, it was only the nose cap of one of the SRBs. Anyone in the know wouldn't have focused on the parachuting nose cap for long, because there was no way for the Challenger crew to have escaped from the shuttle. The Rogers Commission report noted that Columbia had ejection seats similar to those of an SR-71 Blackbird for its 4 test flights early on, but that was when only 2 people were flying. The seats were never meant to be in place for the actual shuttle missions when it was assumed that all risks would have been accounted for and resolved. NASA had in fact considered full crew ejection options back in 1971 when the shuttle was being designed. They examined the feasibility of conventional ejection seats, encapsulated seats, and a whole detachable crew compartment. The problem was the cost of integrating any of these options into the design. Open seats would have cost $10 million, encapsulated seats would have cost $7 million, and the crew compartment option would have added a whopping $292 million to the bill. After the Challenger disaster, the idea of an astronaut escape system was examined once again. A number of designs were considered, but as before, all of them were ultimately rejected due to the difficulty of their implementation. Per the Rogers Commission reports, recovery efforts began within an hour of Challenger's breakup, but the crew wouldn't be found until March 1986. Off the Florida coast, 2 divers came across the crew cabin on the seabed approximately 100 feet below the surface. It was a wreck of twisted metal and wires, and the divers didn't know what they'd found until they saw a spacesuit bobbing in the water. Low on air, the 2 men marked the location and swam for the surface. The next day, the USS Preserver came to recover the lost astronauts. As detailed by NBC News, that was easier said than done. Between the crash and the time spent underwater, their remains weren't in good shape, having at times to be removed in parts. First, Judy Resnick was recovered, followed by Krista McCullough. After this, it was determined that the jagged, jumbled cabin would have to be raised from the ocean in order to continue. As the crane pulled the cabin to the ship, a splash of blue appeared on the surface. It was the jump-suited body of Gregory Jarvis, which had become free as the cabin was raised. As the crew of the Preserver watched in dismay, it sank below the waves again. A search for Jarvis immediately ensued, during which astronaut Robert Crippen even hired his own boat to help. But Jarvis wouldn't be found again for another 5 weeks, 200 yards from where he'd been lost. After failing to convince NASA to stop Challenger's January 28th launch, Morton Thiokol engineer Roger Boisjoly was sent home. As detailed by NASA spaceflight, Boisjoly, fearing the worst, had no intention of watching the launch, but fellow engineer Bob Ebeling convinced him to do so. When the shuttle seemed to lift off just fine, a wave of relief washed over the engineers, until they saw the fireball. Everyone present knew just what had happened. Despite his efforts, Boisjoly felt responsible for the 7 astronauts' deaths, as did Ebeling. Over the following months, the once bulky Boisjoly lost quite a bit of weight and became plagued by headaches, insomnia, and depression. He testified to the Rogers Commission and also sued both NASA and Morton Thiokol. However, his lawsuits weren't successful, and Boisjoly's actions led to his shunning by some of his colleagues, worsening his despair. As told by his wife to NPR, Boisjoly did eventually find peace, however, through speaking to engineering schools about the disaster, which he continued to do until his death in January 2012. According to a report by NASA scientist Joseph P. Kerwin, when the Challenger broke apart, its crew, protected by the cabin, wouldn't have been killed or even seriously injured. But were they still conscious as they fell toward the sea? The answer is unclear. After the orbiter was torn apart, the sturdy crew cabin began to freefall. The central question is how quickly the cabin depressurized. On the ocean floor, the cabin was a mangled mess, but that was due to its impact. Given the damage, it couldn't be determined whether there'd been any breach in the cabin before the crash. There is one chilling indicator of the crew's fate.
Challenge is fast, launch is fast. It's bang, and then it's a 2-minute ride down. And you're conscious, we know that.
Of the 4 personal egress air packs, or PEAPs, that were recovered, 3 had been activated before the impact. However, Kerwin noted that the PEAPs may have been activated instinctively due to depressurization right at breakup, in which case they wouldn't have kept the astronauts awake, as they only provided regular air. For what it's worth, per NBC News, 3-time shuttle commander Robert Overmyer, who participated in the cabin's recovery, is certain that the Challenger's astronauts were conscious. Tragically, there was no chance of survival when the cabin struck the ocean at 207 miles per hour. The sinking of the Titanic was a terrible disaster, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 people. But the story is even worse than the numbers suggest. Here's why the death toll isn't the most disturbing part of the Titanic sinking. It's probably safe to say that the Titanic's designers didn't do much reading of popular fiction. If they had, they might have picked up a little piece of literature entitled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. Although it was a work of fiction released 14 years before the launch of the real-life ship, Futility contains some seriously eerie similarities to the story of the Titanic. The fictional Titan is described as the largest craft afloat, equal to that of a first-class hotel, and unsinkable. Sounds familiar.
So this is the ship they say is unsinkable.
It is unsinkable. God himself could not sink this ship.
But the similarities don't stop there. Like the Titanic, the fictional Titan was about 400 nautical miles away from Newfoundland on a voyage in April when, at close to midnight, it struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. And like the Titanic, the Titan didn't have enough lifeboats for everybody on board. We probably don't have to point out the similarity of the names. It's just a bizarre coincidence, so much so that after the Titanic sank, people began accusing author Morgan Robertson of being some kind of clairvoyant, which he denied. But he did try to cash in on publicity from the disaster, with the book being republished in 1912 with some minor changes and the new Wreck of the Titan title. We'd say too soon, but apparently he came up with it first. The Titanic wasn't the first ship in history to use the SOS distress call, but in 1912, wireless communication was still pretty new, which meant there weren't really any standards regarding monitoring the airwaves. That explains why no one on board the Californian, a ship which was somewhere between 8 and 12 miles away from the Titanic, heard the sinking ship's distress calls. At the time that the Titanic hit the iceberg, the Californian had only one wireless operator, and he'd switched off his equipment and gone to bed.
Well, that's it for me. I'm shutting down.
If he hadn't, he would have known that the Titanic was in trouble within about 15 minutes of the collision when the first distress call was sent. At the time that the Titanic was sinking, the Californian was surrounded by ice and stopped for the night. If the ship had received the SOS call and left immediately, it probably would have taken 30 minutes to get through the ice and another 30 to 60 minutes to reach the Titanic. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to actually sink, so the crew of the Californian would have had more than an hour to collect passengers. They might have even been able to save everyone, but that's not what happened. Making things more tragic, the Californian's crew did see the Titanic's distress rockets, but the captain dismissed them as non-emergency signals meant for some other boat. By the time the Californian turned the radio on the next morning, there was nothing left of the Titanic but bodies floating in the sea. The Titanic wasn't floating blindly through the North Atlantic when it hit the giant iceberg, so why didn't the ship just go around? One theory says the sea was too calm and the two lookouts in the crow's nest weren't able to see waves breaking at the iceberg's base. According to another theory, the crow's nest didn't have any binoculars. Except that one isn't really a theory, it's really an unfortunate fact. Let's get this straight. The Titanic had rowing machines, an electric horse, a squash court, and a heated swimming pool, but it didn't have a pair of binoculars on board? Well, it did, but at the time the ship struck the iceberg, they were unhelpfully locked away in a cabinet, and no one could find the key. That key was back in England in the pocket of a crew member who had disembarked the ship.
Whoopsie-daisy.
That crew member was David Blair, who served as the Titanic's second officer between the ports of Belfast and Southampton. But before the ship's maiden voyage to New York, the White Star Line decided to replace him at the last minute. In his rush to disembark, he forgot to give the key to his replacement, a mistake that potentially doomed more than 1,500 people. Before the Titanic left, Blair sent a postcard to his sister-in-law in which he wrote in part, "This is a magnificent ship, and I feel very disappointed I'm not going to make her first voyage." Imagine how disappointed his crewmates felt when they couldn't find that key. Every life lost on the Titanic was a tragedy, from third-class Jack to first-class Rose, except Rose didn't actually die. And, oh yeah, they're fictional. But even though all the real-life stories are devastating, some are harder to read than others. One especially awful story is about Ramon Artagabatia, who survived the sinking of a ship called the America, which sank off the coast of Uruguay in 1871. According to his own letters, Ramon may have suffered from PTSD after his first shipwreck experience, which is pretty understandable. But if you've already lived through one shipwreck, the worst has gotta be behind you. It couldn't happen again, right?
It happened again.
After years of anxiety, Ramon wrote to a cousin about his faith in the Titanic, with words that now read as tragically ironic. "At last I will be able to travel, and above all, I will be able to sleep calm." Ramon died in the disaster, and his body was recovered about a week after the sinking. Once the disaster started to take hold, nobody could really have saved everyone on the Titanic, but there were plenty of acts of heroism on that fateful night. One underpublicized act of heroism is the sacrifice of the ship's engineers. There were 35 of them on board the Titanic, but despite that large crew number, we have no first-hand accounts of what they were actually doing during the ship's final moments. That's because they all died.
Go to maximum more! Push it! I'm giving it all she's got, Captain!
Here's what we do know. While the ship was going down, the engineering team stayed at their post and kept the lights on. That's a bigger deal than it might sound like it is. Remember, this was in the middle of the North Atlantic on a night without a full moon. Beyond the ship's own lighting, there was just darkness in the sea. The electric lights made it possible for the crew to load the lifeboats and keep passengers from panicking. Power also made it possible for the radio operators to continue transmitting distress signals. Even though their efforts didn't save the ship, their sacrifice doubtlessly helped save many lives. It's hard to believe that one meager iceberg could take down the biggest thing in the ocean with just a glancing blow. And until the wreckage of the ship was discovered in 1985, people could only speculate about the exact nature of the Titanic's vulnerability. For a while, researchers wondered if the Titanic might have been built out of low-quality steel, but that theory was disproven when large pieces of the ship were recovered and tested. Sonar mapping of the side that struck the iceberg revealed only 6 thin tears in the hull, which would have left roughly 12 square feet open to the sea. That by itself wouldn't have been enough to sink a ship like the Titanic, which had 16 watertight compartments. So what happened? In 1998, an analysis was conducted on the rivets of the ship's wreckage, which found that the wrought iron contained 3 times as much slag as modern standards allow for. That's very interesting, but what is slag?
Flag!
In case you're not a blacksmith, shipbuilder, or rivet maker, slag is the glass-like residue left behind by metal ore after the smelting process. According to the theory, all that extra slag used in the rivets made them brittle in cold temperatures, so the iceberg just sheared off the heads as it scraped along the side of the ship. When that happened, the rivets came loose, the hull plate separated, and water came rushing in. So basically, the Titanic shipbuilders seem to have cut some crucial corners leading to dire consequences. This can happen when you rush things. When it comes to most projects, you can do something fast or you can do it right. The builders behind the Titanic apparently chose the fast option, and it shows. 4 days after the disaster, the Boston Globe declared all drowned but 868. But there are 2 inaccurate things about that headline. The first problem is the number of survivors, which was actually closer to about 700. The second was the manner of death. While the sinking of the Titanic claimed many victims, not everyone who lost their lives in the disaster died by drowning. The Titanic didn't really have that many drowning victims, at least not as many as you would think. Those who remained in the ship probably drowned as the Titanic sank and the ship's breathable air was displaced, but those who jumped into the water were mostly wearing life preservers, making them much less likely to drown. There's also the fact that the survivors who were safely in the lifeboats later reported hearing the awful din kicked up by those in the water, suggesting that most of the people floating around the boats weren't drowning. Drowning is a thing that happens silently. People who are in the middle of it typically can't call out for help. What really worked to kill so many people was freezing. The seawater in the North Atlantic was only 28 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of the Titanic sinking, which is 4 degrees below the freezing temperature of fresh water. That's more than cold enough to damage the human body. It's possible that as people lost consciousness from the cold temperature, they inhaled water, which hastened their deaths. But that's not drowning as we understand it. It's drowning as a side effect of being incapacitated by hypothermia. If the ship crashed in the Caribbean in some 80-degree water, lots more people may have made it back to shore alive. But if that was the case, it probably wouldn't have hit an iceberg either. If anything, it maybe would have hit a Carnival cruise ship, or the Bermuda Triangle, or maybe some of these guys. Look, the Seven Seas can be a really crazy place. Imagine that it's the spring of 1912 and you're still reeling from the death of a loved one who went down with the Titanic. Maybe they were one of the people who rather grandly played in the ship's band, providing musical comfort to doomed passengers as the ship slowly sank. You miss your father, your brother, your son, and then you get billed for his uniform. This is something that actually happened. While it may not be as disturbing as some of the other things we know about the Titanic, it's a pretty ugly footnote. One example of this happening can be found in the story of musician John Hume, who was booked on the Titanic through a firm called C.W. and F.N. Black. 2 weeks after the sinking, Hume's father received a bill for his son's uniform, which included items like his lapel pin and white star buttons. The bill amounted to 14 shillings and 7 pence, and that's before you count the insult of even getting a bill at all. Okay, so if you spilled mustard on your uniform because you were eating a messy burger in your off time, maybe you had that bill coming. But the Titanic's dead musicians weren't responsible for the destruction of their uniforms, and the dead musicians' parents definitely weren't responsible.
In a way that's deeply capitalist.
Anyway, Hume's dad refused to pay and sent the letter to the Amalgamated Musicians Union, who published the outrageous demand in their newsletter. So now you know that even if you're a victim of a Titanic-scale disaster, some companies will still try to get money from you literally over your dead body.
On April 26, 1986, there was a catastrophic accident at the USSR's nuclear power plant near Chernobyl. Despite the couple of immediate deaths caused by the explosion, other effects of the disaster were arguably much worse. Here are some less discussed, terrible things about the Chernobyl disaster. The meltdown at Chernobyl never should have happened. There was plenty of warning that something could go wrong long before the power plant there had even been built. Chernobyl's reactors were the same kind as those at a nuclear facility in Leningrad, and when those had powered up in 1973, at least 3 major problems with the Soviets' new design quickly became obvious. There were major differences between how the inventors predicted the design would function and how it actually worked. But no one bothered to look into those issues. That meant there was no information on how this new type of reactor would behave in an accident. On November 30th, 1975, over a decade before the Chernobyl disaster, the Leningrad reactors suffered a partial meltdown as the plant was brought back online after scheduled maintenance. Nothing could be done to stop the chain reaction, and radiation poured into the atmosphere.
Means the fire we're watching with our own eyes is giving off nearly twice the radiation released by the bomb in Hiroshima. And that's every single hour.
The official line from the commission set up to investigate the Leningrad accident was that a small manufacturing defect was to blame. What they really found were massive problems with the design of the reactor itself, but those findings were suppressed. The commission did make recommendations on various changes to that kind of reactor, including new safety regulations and a faster emergency protection system. They were completely ignored, and Chernobyl was built with the same fundamentally flawed reactor as Leningrad. From the outside, the Chernobyl meltdown initially appeared to be a relatively small, manageable fire, and the Soviet government was in no hurry to reveal how dangerous it was, even to their own people. Scientists in Sweden were actually the first to notice something was up and alerted the outside world to the radioactive fallout emitting from around Kiev. The USSR still stayed silent even as international news covered Chernobyl as a major disaster. When their state TV finally had to admit there'd been an accident, it assured Soviet citizens the West was spreading exaggerated reports as propaganda and that while there had been a bit of an issue, everything was already taken care of. This was, of course, a lie, and it had deadly consequences. The people living close to the biggest nuclear accident in history initially had no idea the danger they were facing. With radiation pouring out over the nearby town, the government repeatedly refused to order an evacuation, and plant workers were forbidden from telling anyone about the accident. Finally, after 2 days, the order came and officials gave residents less than an hour to evacuate. Being told you have 50 minutes to pack, grab your family, leave your pets and valuables, and get out of town is unbelievably stressful in the best circumstances, and the circumstances of the Chernobyl disaster were far from the best. According to the World Health Organization, 116,000 people were evacuated immediately, with an additional 230,000 following over the next few years. The stress brought on by losing their homes is one of the often overlooked tolls of those affected. Families were even split up during the evacuation, making things even more traumatic for children and their parents. The trauma of Chernobyl didn't end quickly either. In 2013, a study at the University of Southern California found millions of people were still suffering from mental health problems related to the accident. There was even a resulting mistrust in doctors. Both relocated people and those who got to stay put still showed a diminished quality of life, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
And now you want us to swim underneath a burning reactor. Do you even know how contaminated it is?
The brave people who cleaned up Chernobyl for 3 years after the accident were taken advantage of from the beginning. The government suppressed information on how dangerous the job was, and almost all liquidators were sent in with inadequate protection against radiation. When machines broke under the pressure, they moved the radioactive debris with their hands. At least 28 died horribly within weeks, and thousands more died from the effects of radiation or became disabled from exposure. You'd think the governments involved would be grateful, but the liquidators are still fighting for support today after years of seeking compensation and protesting against benefit cuts. The most pronounced long-term physical health effect among survivors of Chernobyl is thyroid cancer, and according to the United Nations, it wasn't just radiation emanating from the reactor that caused it. Thousands of children appear to have gotten cancer from drinking radioactive milk. By 2005, 6,000 people who were children and adolescents at the time of the disaster developed thyroid cancer and were left with a grim reminder of what they'd been through. Removal of the thyroid resulted in a distinctive scar on the neck that became known as the Chernobyl necklace and carried a stigma with it. The good news is that virtually all the individuals who got thyroid cancer survived. Amazingly, the issue still isn't over today. In 2016, a journalist in what is now Belarus saw cows grazing near signs warning radiation was higher than normal. He sent a sample of milk to a lab to see if it was still dangerous all these years on, and it was, with a radioactive isotope level that was 10 times higher than the safe level. The government also wanted to suppress the findings, since exporting milk is a big business for the country, and pointing out it's still affected by Chernobyl wouldn't be good for the economy. The company sued the journalist and won, so plenty of people in the area are still drinking contaminated, potentially cancer-causing milk. While the people around the Chernobyl plant were eventually warned and evacuated, the animals in the surrounding areas weren't so lucky. Sadly, dogs, cats, and farm animals were the victims of some of the disaster's most devastating effects. Ranchers noticed a dramatic increase of genetic abnormalities in farm animals born after the accident, and unfortunately the same goes for wild animals living near Chernobyl. Grazing animals like elk may look fine, but they have high rates of radiation in their bodies. And then there's Chernobyl's dog population.
Yeah, they're radioactive, so they have to go. But it's not hard, they're mostly pets.
When people were evacuated, they were told to leave their pets behind, and while an effort was made by the Soviet army to eliminate the animal population, many of them survived. The result was what appears to be a large and apparently thriving population of stray dogs in the exclusion zone, numbering in the hundreds. In a minor but still pretty depressing development, the dogs may have high levels of radiation and possible exposure to rabies, meaning that they're very dangerous for visitors to pet. The good news, however, is that a nonprofit called Clean the Futures Fund has launched a program called Dogs of Chernobyl. For the past few years, they've been working with the support of international veterinary volunteers to help manage the canine population in a way that's far more humane than the Soviet Union's initial strategy of containment by extermination. With the advancement of technology over the past 30 years and the worldwide attention that's been given to the Chernobyl disaster since 1986, it might seem like the area would be cleaned up by now. Sadly, it's not even close. By some estimates, much of the area won't be safe for human habitation for 3,000 years, and one geologist thinks it's more like 1 million. When the reactor blew, it only lost 5% of its enriched uranium. That means 190 tons are still in Chernobyl's shell, combined into a massive mess with concrete, steel, and other debris from the explosion that clocks in at around 2,000 tons. Unfortunately, the technology to safely take that fused mass apart and dispose of it doesn't exist yet, and even in the best-case scenario, it won't for at least a few decades. The only option currently available is containing the site underneath a new concrete and steel sarcophagus built in 2017, but even that will only last 100 years. One Ukrainian energy policy expert's actual solution is to just hope that the next century brings a new generation made up of people who are a whole lot smarter than we are so that they can figure out how to solve this radioactive puzzle. The logistics of containing what is effectively an unplanned nuclear waste dump until the year 4986, assuming humans are still around, are almost beyond comprehension. Still, some people aren't willing to wait and have moved back to just outside or even into the exclusion zone. Even the good area is still radioactive though, and some residents go about their daily lives with Geiger counters around their necks. By the time of the Chernobyl disaster, people knew fossil fuels were terrible for the environment. Nuclear meltdowns are also very bad, though, and having the planet die slowly is a lot less scary than a nuclear plant that could kill you tomorrow. In the 1970s, nuclear power was thought to be the next big thing. Compared to coal, it was cheap and much better for the planet. Then the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl disasters happened in the span of 7 years. After that, most everyone accepted fossil fuels as the better route. Partially due to fears of another Chernobyl, the US didn't open a single nuclear power plant between 1996 and 2016. Meanwhile, it, and almost all other countries, has been burning fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow. In terms of sheer body count, nuclear power may have been the better choice from the beginning. In the end, Chernobyl could kill an estimated 4,000 people, but deadly meltdowns are fortunately very rare. Meanwhile, Wired reports that about 7,500 people die from problems related to coal-burning power plants every single year. A switch to nuclear, which Chernobyl's preventable disaster helped delay, could have saved some of those lives, plus slowed down the destruction of the environment, assuming that we learned something from the disaster and made things a little safer. Chernobyl gave Earth a major dose of radiation in 1986, and global climate change, which the disaster helped to speed up, is going to make sure it's a gift that keeps on giving. In 2019, scientists studied glaciers in 17 sites across the world. They found the levels of radioactive material were much, much higher than what you'd see anywhere outside of an exclusion zone like the one around Chernobyl, in some cases 10 times higher. Every single site had nuclear fallout present, and not deep down, but on the rapidly melting surface ice, which may have a disastrous impact.
An impact means completely uninhabitable for a minimum of 100 years.
To be fair, it's not all Chernobyl's fault. Anytime radioactive material is released into the atmosphere, whether from nuclear tests or the atomic bombs used in World War II, or other meltdowns, it ends up mixing with clouds. If it falls as snow onto the ice, the heavy sediment results in concentrated levels of nuclear residue. To be less fair to Chernobyl, it released so much radioactive stuff into the atmosphere that when researchers took core samples of the glaciers, they could see that the disaster caused a massive spike in the nuclear material they found. The radioactive material is soluble in water, which means it will probably end up in the food chain as global warming melts the glaciers. Even more worryingly, there isn't enough data to know how much of this particularly dangerous substance could make it back to humans.
The Apollo 1 fire was a horrific tragedy, but the worst part was that it could have been avoided. Here's a deep dive into the decisions and circumstances that foreshadowed the deaths of 3 astronauts. During a series of tests at the Kennedy Space Center on January 27, 1967, fire broke out in the command module of Apollo 1. All 3 astronauts inside, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, died in flames. While disasters like the Challenger and Columbia shuttles took place during their respective missions, Apollo 1 differs in that her crew never actually made it to their launch. Instead, the accident took place in the middle of a testing day, and even before the catastrophic fire, it was already something of a mess. The day played host to a ton of different technical issues. Most notable were the communication issues. The astronauts inside Apollo 1's command module should have been able to talk with their co-workers in the nearby buildings, but for whatever reason, those systems weren't working. The whole thing really got on Gus Grissom's nerves in particular, and he yelled out,
"Now we gotta get the moon. We can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings."
The command module itself was giving the astronauts a number of problems. Pumping it full of oxygen kept triggering alarms for no apparent reason, on top of making it incredibly difficult to even open the hatch. But seeing as how the boosters didn't have any fuel in them, the crew figured that things were safe enough for them to continue forward. One of the primary factors in the Apollo 1 fire was the environment inside the command module. The space was pressurized with pure oxygen at 16.7 psi. Oxygen is of course highly flammable, so any spark would have been enough to create the huge flame. But there's a whole history here that actually makes this a lot more complicated. During the testing of the early Mercury capsules back in 1959, engineers intended the capsule's environment to be a mix of nitrogen and oxygen, but logistically it would have been too heavy and the mix ratio too complicated. So they settled on pure oxygen at 5 psi. But for ground tests, the low oxygen content caused an astronaut to pass out, so they upped the pressure. The higher pressure was effectively grandfathered into the Apollo tests, but the main difference was that the Apollo modules were a lot larger than the Mercury capsules. More space meant more oxygen, and that in turn meant more possibility of fire. Engineers recommended that mix of nitrogen and oxygen again, but NASA nixed the idea for fear that an accident might cause decompression sickness in that environment, so they kept with the pure oxygen atmosphere instead. Considering the rapid and intense nature of the fatal fire, the hatch to the Apollo 1 command module might seem like a pretty irrelevant thing to consider, but the hatch was no simple thing, and some poor design decisions might have condemned the astronauts to death. After all, if the 3 men had been able to quickly escape, then the tragedy would have been avoided. The hatch was in fact a death trap. It consisted of multiple different parts, including an inner and outer hatch, both of which served different purposes and had to be opened using different tools. The inner hatch also opened inward, which was a problem on its own. The pressure inside the module was higher than it was outside, a good thing in space since it helped keep the hatch closed, but a bad thing on land because it made the door even harder to open. Engineers recommended including explosive bolts that could knock the hatch off its hinges in an emergency, only for NASA to shoot that down. Missions after Apollo 4 corrected both of those mistakes by introducing an easily removable unified hatch, but the crew of Apollo 1 had to struggle with a hatch that was designed to lead to failure. The pure oxygen atmosphere in the Apollo 1 command module was already a disaster waiting to happen, but oxygen wasn't the only flammable issue. There's plenty of technology we wouldn't have without the space race, but at the time, American astronauts had discovered the usefulness of a very different technology: Velcro. It was a supremely practical solution to a uniquely space-based problem. Things that could start floating around in zero gravity were easily secured by just sticking them to Velcro positioned all around the interior of the spacecraft. They'd gotten pretty dependent on it, and it was tradition to customize Velcro positions prior to missions, to the point that fire prevention rules were getting forgotten. After all, Velcro is flammable, and it was getting stuck to places less than a foot from potential ignition sources. On its own, that was already courting danger, but Apollo 1 was even worse. Accounts of the command module describe it as wall-to-wall Velcro. No one realized until afterward that the increased oxygen content would cause these things to burn twice as fast as in earlier tests. All in all, Michael Collins, later calling the module a tinderbox, was quite accurate.
At 17 psi pure oxygen, Velcro explodes.
Many of the failures that led to the Apollo 1 tragedy were technical in nature. However, some of the factors were pure human error. On one hand, this wasn't a bunch of amateurs who were constantly making mistakes. Astronaut Michael Collins responded to the official NASA report on the disaster by explaining that even the smartest of people could miss the most obvious things, stating, "I don't know why, we're blind to them. I mean, it makes us think that the quality of our engineering across the board was juvenile, yet it wasn't. It was very good engineering."
There's so many things that can go wrong. The machinery is compact but complex, extremely complex.
But that blindness might also have been a bit more intentional. Earlier in the decade, President John F. Kennedy had promised that people would watch the moon landing, and that started putting pressure on NASA. As a result, the teams working on Apollo 1 were taking risks and ignoring problems. Flight Director Gene Kranz explained that there were plenty of botched simulations. Plans were far from finalized, and procedures kept changing over and over, but nobody did anything to address it. All anyone wanted was to keep their schedule, so they kept pretending there weren't issues. In taking the blame for the tragedy, Kranz summed things up by saying, "We were rolling the dice, hoping that things would come together by launch day, when in our hearts we knew it would take a miracle." In much the same way that the Challenger space shuttle explosion could have been avoided, the same could be said of Apollo 1. Had technicians just seen the dangers or kept safety protocols in mind, then maybe 3 men wouldn't have died on that day. But it goes far deeper than technical mistakes. NASA officials were explicitly told how much danger they were reporting, and they chose to ignore it. The contractors who recommended that the Apollo missions be tested using a mix of nitrogen and oxygen were completely shot down by NASA officials. Over the course of multiple different arguments, they were told just to do their job without question, despite internal notes fully recognizing the validity of those concerns, one of which even mentions, "It has been observed that a number of otherwise non-flammable materials, even human skin, will burst into flame in a pure oxygen atmosphere." Officially, NASA's response was more or less indifferent, expressing faith that a fire was unlikely. But once again, internal documents betray that confidence. The program's director, Joe Shea, privately noted, "The problem is sticky. We think we have enough margin to keep fire from starting. If one ever does, we do have problems." In retrospect, there are a lot of reasons to think that Apollo 1 was a doomed mission from the start, whether that has to do with rather obvious unsafe testing parameters or the other errors and mishaps that had already occurred earlier that day. But the most telling thing might be the fact that those directly involved in the mission could see the problems coming from a mile away. The three astronauts, and Gus Grissom in particular, seemed to have some pretty major reservations about the fate of their mission.
There is some risk. I recognize it, but just try to take as much of that out as we can during the pre-testing.
Grissom reportedly told a journalist that he'd consider the mission successful if he just got his men home alive. A worthy goal, but not exactly a high bar. Astronaut Wally Schirra even told him, "If you get the slightest glitch, get out of there. I don't like it." To really make their feelings known, the three men of Apollo 1 even went so far as to take a mocking photo, which has instead become tragically ironic, all of them with their heads bowed in prayer, just hoping they would come home safely. And they had good reason to be concerned. The craft was undergoing constant modifications to both its hardware and software. Said hardware was literally broken or leaking at times, and those problems were well known among the crew.
It had so many parts, it seems, that people lost count. Some technicians say it had 2 million. Some say 3.
Of course, there's no ignoring the fact that the Apollo 1 disaster led to the deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee, but it's also worth mentioning that the other technicians present at the scene lived through a harrowing experience of their own. Though the crew running the tests was spread throughout multiple rooms, the command module was directly connected to an area called a White Room. The technicians stationed in that room reacted immediately to the fire, trying to free their friends, only to be blasted by columns of fire themselves as pressure vessels ruptured and sent flames arcing toward them. Those who arrived in the room later found it filled with fire and smoke, ashes, and burning pieces of Teflon. The men continued trying to pry the hatch open, choking on fumes and blinded by smoke, all while knowing that a nearby escape rocket would explode if the fire got to it. Given the string of mechanical failures, lapses in judgment, and unintentional blindness that culminated in a near-literal powder keg on that tragic day in 1967, it's a small comfort to know that there was probably very little suffering when Grissom, White, and Chaffee were killed by that fire, because the fire wasn't what killed them, at least not directly. Of course, the fire did cause extensive burns to all three men, but autopsies determined that the majority of those injuries were suffered post-mortem. The fire actually burned through the oxygen hoses on the astronauts' suits, and they quickly fell unconscious due to the carbon monoxide flooding their suits. Officially, they passed away from asphyxiation and cardiac arrest. Several days later, sobered and resolute, Gene Kranz told his team, "We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we locked out all of the problems we saw each day in our work. Every element of the program was in trouble, and so were we. I don't know what Thompson's committee will find as the cause, but I know what I find. We are the cause. We were not ready. We did not do our job." After the tragedy, NASA implemented major overhauls of the Apollo program to ensure it would never happen again. Engineers got their oxygen-nitrogen mix. The module hatch was redesigned from the ground up. Live wires were shielded in metal. Those and other changes led to the successes of later Apollo missions and arguably the success of the entire space program. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee never got to see the monumental achievements they paid so dearly to bring about. Bad news? You're being raided by the Vikings. Good news? You might be able to avoid some of their more creative torture methods. To die in the middle of a Viking raid was brutal and bloody, but for the most part, it was also quick. Early Viking raids were relatively small, extremely brutal, and tended to be over very quickly. And while you wouldn't want to find yourself caught up in one, they weren't anything people weren't already used to. It was the late 8th century when the Vikings appeared in Britain, after all, a time when you could wind up in anything from a massive battle to a skirmish between rival families or towns. It wasn't an easy time to live, and the Vikings were just one more headache for people to deal with. Don't cry too many tears over those who died in the Viking raids then. It was the survivors who had it much, much worse. Monasteries and churches were always favorite targets for the Vikings. For the rest of the world, anyone who would defile sacred places and murder God's servants was nothing short of wicked. This was a time when religion was at the heart of life for many towns and people, and that made the Vikings' disrespect of God's domain even worse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the Vikings as wild heathens who trampled upon saints' bones and destroyed God's house.
This is their God, and he's dead. He's nailed to the cross.
Vikings looted many of the monasteries and churches they raided, stealing pretty much anything they could get their hands on. In some cases, they even stole ornate reliquaries that were used to hold sacred saints' relics. For a Christian, this would be more or less unthinkable. Perhaps unsurprisingly, people at the time struggled to discern the Vikings' motivations, and many came to the conclusion that they were the physical manifestation of God's fury. Scribes and monks lamented the violence and crime they saw in the world around them, and wrote that the Vikings had been sent to deliver retribution on morally corrupt people of the world. Others referenced terrible omens that heralded the coming of Vikings, including great lightning storms, famine, and even dragons. Today, we can only imagine the fear that the victims of these raids must have felt to come face to face with the wrath of God. Vikings didn't only raid to loot and kill, they also sought to reinforce a vital part of the Viking economy, slavery. Most Viking slaves were taken from the British Isles and Eastern Europe. Occasionally, native Vikings who committed crimes at home were also reduced to the status of slave. While there's not a lot of contemporary evidence regarding the lives of Viking slaves, archaeologists have been able to piece together a few details. Thousands of people could be enslaved in a single Viking raid. Many were sold to the Vikings' countrymen in Scandinavia who had stayed at home to work the fields. Wool was a huge industry at the time, as it was needed for the ship's sails, and archaeological evidence indicates that many slaves ended up laboring on huge plantations. Ancient poems suggest they were given names like Bastard, Stumpy, and Stinker, and when they died, they were just left laying around as food for dogs and birds. For some idea of how much or little a human life was valued, consider this. Viking trade records show a female slave was worth the same as a cow and an ox, while 4 male slaves had the same worth as 2 horses, or a suit of chainmail. There can be little doubt that every day of a Viking slave's life is going to be filled with fear, starvation, abuse, and backbreaking labor. Norse beliefs held that it wasn't just the rest of a slave's life that was going to be hard, however. As far as they were concerned, the afterlife wouldn't be much better. Researchers have discovered numerous Viking burial sites in which both men and women were interred with grave goods. These items were offerings that the deceased could take into the afterlife. It tended to include weapons and jewelry, some of which came from far afield.
What else have we got here? Well, we have some brooches, and then we have the Buddha.
Buddha?
But many Vikings share their graves with other bodies, which show signs of malnourishment, injury, and a brutal death. Those are the slaves who were sacrificed and buried with their masters so they could serve them for eternity in the afterlife. It gets worse, too. Almost every Viking slave burial site has been different in some way, and this has led some archaeologists to put forward a terrifying theory. They believe that as part of the burial ritual, the Norse might have recreated important events from the life of the deceased, the slave standing in for the dead man. Did a dead man or woman lose a limb, get their teeth knocked out, or suffer some other catastrophic injury? Well, guess who had to recreate all that before they were sacrificed and tossed in the ground? Historian Mary Valenti has made a compelling and disturbing argument when it comes to the early Viking raids in Britain. She claims that when they attacked monasteries, the Vikings were looking to capture monks for a very specific reason. Buried in writings and biographies from the era are mentions of large numbers of slaves being transported from Western Europe through Italy and finally to Byzantium in the Middle East. These captives were then put to work as teachers, guards, and even harem servants. Those roles were important in these cultures, and they had to meet certain requirements. They needed to be literate, they needed to be educated, and they needed to be eunuchs. Valente argues that many of the monks, scribes, and acolytes taken from monasteries during Viking raids were young men who had the first 2 requirements covered, so when they were shipped off to Italy, they were castrated to fulfill the last one. Throughout the Viking era, demand for these eunuch slaves rose steadily, and there's a good chance that many of the men who didn't die in Viking raids ended up wishing they had. For a long time, historians have been trying to figure out just why the Vikings started raiding, and one still popular theory was suggested around 1,000 years ago by Dudo of St. Quentin. The basics are this: Vikings practiced polygyny, which is the idea that a man could not only take multiple wives, but also keep concubines. The more powerful the man, the more women he had. To each his own, right? Well, that's the problem. So many powerful Vikings were taking so many wives that each man didn't have his own. Research suggests that the large numbers of unmarried Viking men helped drive not just raiding parties, but the taking of female captives. There's a good chance those female captives were forced to return home with their Viking bachelors, where they would be put to work as domestic slaves and childbearing concubines. These unfortunate women were sometimes seen primarily as sex slaves, and when they did have children, one of 2 things could happen. The children could either be acknowledged as the official children of the father, or they could be forced into a life of slavery themselves. Many of the most well-known Viking torture methods walk the line between fact and fiction. It's unclear just how fictionalized some contemporary writings about the Vikings are, but the legends are a testament to how creative they seem to have been when it came to violence. First and most famously, there's the Blood Eagle. This has been described as the fate of several Vikings, but just how widely it was practiced is still up for debate, if it was ever practiced at all. The blood eagle involved carving the shape of an eagle into the victim's back, then cutting the ribs away from the spine and pulling out the lungs so they looked like an eagle's wings.
I'm told it is the worst, most painful death of all, but astonishing.
Another kind of torture turned execution method is described in Jarl's saga, so it may or may not actually be true. After the Battle of Clontarf, Ulf Harada reportedly inflicted an ungodly amount of pain onto a fellow Viking named Brodir in retribution for killing an Irish king. Ulf, it was said, sliced open a bit of Brodir, pulled out some of his intestines, and ordered him to walk around and around a tree, pulling out the rest of his innards as he walked. That doesn't look so bad right now, does it? Sometimes the Vikings would like the look of the lands they raided, so they decided to stick around. This is exactly what happened in Iceland, and when the Norsemen decided to make the island their home, they set out to destroy its forests. Trees were used for construction, heating, and charcoal for forges, while the land was used for planting crops and grazing animals. Within a few hundred years, Iceland was left with a landscape that was almost entirely treeless. That was fine for the Vikings, of course, but in the 21st century, the repercussions have been devastating. With no trees to secure the soil against Iceland's brutal winds, erosion has become a major problem. The soil, which contains a lot of volcanic rock and ash, blows away with a force that could strip the paint off cars. This has made farming impossible, grazing land scarce, and sandstorms a way of life for Icelanders. It has even impacted Iceland's ability to regulate their emissions, as there are no trees to absorb the carbon dioxide produced by the country and its inhabitants. Iceland has been trying to re-establish their forests since the 19th century, when a devastating sandstorm buried much of Grunge, killing hundreds of livestock. Today, Iceland is still only around 1.5% forested, but there is finally some cause for optimism among the rewilders.
The forests are growing better than anybody ever thought. People will more and more look at them and say, hey, this is something that's worth having.
By the time Ethelred the Unready became the king of the English at the turn of the 11th century, the Vikings had been raiding and pillaging their way up and down the British coast for around 200 years. Obviously, people had more than had enough of the Norse, an issue exacerbated by the fact that many of them never left. Ethelred's Britain was divided between Anglo-Saxons who lived in the south and the Danes who had settled in the north. Even though Viking settlers intermingled and in some cases intermarried with their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, much tension existed between the two cultures. This all came to a head when, after being informed that the Vikings were trying to kill him, Ethelred issued a call to arms. On November 13, 1002, he ordered his faithful subjects to kill all Danes living in Britain. It's unclear how many died during the St. Brice's Day massacre, but multiple mass grave sites have been found dating to the time of Ethelred's decree. Among them were a group who sought shelter in an Oxford church that was burned down by an angry mob outside, as well as that of Gunhild, the sister of Denmark's King Svein. Her death added still more fuel to the fire and eventually led to the largest Viking invasion that Britain had ever seen. Some of the survivors of Viking raids were simply too valuable to sell into slavery, but there's no telling how life was going to turn out for them. Some of the Icelandic sagas record the taking of hostages, including the tale of Olaf Tryggvason and Sigurd the Stout, in which Olaf takes Sigurd's son hostage as a guarantee that he will fall in line. It's believed by many that political hostages were taken more often than most would expect, and according to research from the New University of Lisbon, it was pretty common for Vikings to ransom them back to their families. Unfortunately, paying the ransom would often devastate entire families, leaving them destitute. Sometimes it just didn't work out for the hostages. One of the most well-documented instances of brutality against hostages comes from Canute the Great. Canute was forced to flee England for the safety of Denmark when the Anglo-Saxons refused to acknowledge him as his father's heir, and during his escape he cut off the ears, noses, and hands of the hostages he had been given as a token of goodwill. Anything else the Vikings believed would have been weakness.